Hello and welcome to another In Conversation. My name is Indy Bhullar and I work as a curator at LSE Library, and you join us in the reading room of LSE Library. The idea behind today's event is that we'll be speaking to a researcher, and that could be anyone, someone who's researched a book or a talk or a PhD, and we're going to talk to them about their research and in particular what brought them to LSE Library and some of the archive collections and special collections that are here. And then we're going to look in detail at some of those materials and items and documents from the course of their research and explore them in a little bit more depth and detail. Helping me do that today is Dr. Noni Stacey. Thank you very much for joining us. Noni is a writer, a political researcher and a photographic historian, and has had a number of different roles in both media and publishing, including working as a freelance picture editor and researcher at publications such as The Guardian Weekend Magazine, The Guardian and The Independent on Sunday. Noni has also worked as a TV news producer and a journalist. She held a role as a researcher in the Labour Party in the early 1980s, and her first job was as an editorial assistant on The Teacher, which was the journal of the NUT, the National Union of Teachers. Her latest book, which is sort of what brought us here today for this event, is called Photography of Protest and Community, The Radical Collectives of the 1970s, which is published by Lund Humphreys, and it kind of, I think, grew out of your doctorate, which you were awarded in 2017, which focused on similar territory. I think it was titled Community Photography, Radicalism and a Culture of Protest in the Photography Collectives of the 1970s. So.
Yes. That's it, and actually I'd started the research before then, when I'd left working in the media to go and do an MA in the History and Theory of Photography at Sotheby's Institute of Art. Yeah. And so I'd started that research there and then followed it through in the PhD. Brilliant. and then the book. So I found it a fascinating area. Yeah. The 1970s, it was a period of turmoil. Political, economic and social, but it was also, it had its roots in sort of counterculture with these photographers and the alternative press, to find different ways of doing things, to work against the mainstream media. That was one of their main sort of tenets. Yeah. Because you had, for newspapers and magazines, you had photojournalists who would be sent on assignment, often for a very short amount of time to take pictures. So with the collectives that I'm looking at, they wanted to find a different way of working. And I came to the LSE because one of the collectives that I'm looking at, Exit Photography Group, has their archive here.
Yes. So
that was, and also a lot of the 1970s was a period of growth of sociology. And a lot of the people who were writing at that time were, from the LSE. It's a repository for a lot of that research. So it was a good place to be. And also, obviously, you've got the Women's Library.
There's a lovely photo which, you've included on the kind of just after the title page. It's of a postcard. And it reads, postcards showing a suffragette selling copies of the Suffragette newspaper of the 25th of October 1912. And it's a lovely photo of a woman standing behind a placard, and the placard has the front page of that edition of the Suffragette, and the placard reads, The Suffragette, and the headline is An Anti-Shock by James Barr. And James Barr was your great-grandfather?
Yes, yes. So he was writing about, because both he and his daughter, who's my grandmother, who's the one holding the placard here, he was writing about someone who was anti-suffrage. And it's quite I don't know if the suffragette is very, very wordy, because obviously it was to do with methods of printing and things. And it's quite a lengthy but humorous and warm article about how, if a movement such as the suffragette movement has gained strength, it then of course oppositions form, and that he called for tolerance.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's a lovely article and very well written. I might add. He was a writer, wasn't he?
He was. Yes.
Yeah, by trade.
He did. He and his brother wrote fiction as well. Yeah.
So you've kind of explained that, and it's a nice link between your book and the library, another one, because obviously, as you mentioned, we've got the Women's Library. We have that exact copy of the Suffragettes in our collection, and we've digitised the article. It's up online for anyone who wants to see it. It's up online.
It's also about protest, though, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, the suffragettes were, so well turned out, and but it also, the movement included, they were treated violently, they were force fed. There were all sorts of transgressions in trying to stop this movement.
Yeah.
But there they are with the handmade placard, which I really like,
Definitely.
and children involved, and it was it was a force for change.
Yeah, absolutely. With a very strong visual culture of its own, wasn't it?
They were very they were very good at photographing things and documenting, and organising. Just really good at organising.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So that's just one sort of element. We haven't gone past the fourth page, I think, in that discussion there. But the book itself covers all sorts of different organisations and groups and collectives. But there's one in particular, I think you mentioned them before, that brought you to the LSE Library. Am I right in thinking that?
Exit Photography Group.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to explain a little bit about who they were or what they did?
Yes, they were very young. They had an initial grouping of 4 or 5 people, and then it became a grouping of Christy Perkins, Paul Trevor, and Nicholas Battier. And they were all self-taught. They came from different areas. Paul was the only one who'd sort of been grown up in partly in the East End. And they all wanted to either work in film or photography, but all of them were engaged in politics and social action at that time. That's what brought all of these collectives together. They were passionate about photography. It was exciting. It was, transgressive in many ways. They weren't looking towards the gallery so much. It was about political action and protest. So they came together, and Chris had just seen a little postcard up at the Photographers Gallery looking for a photographer who was interested in social issues.
Just a little advert.
Yes, it was a little advert, and they did their first publication was called Down Wapping. And they were partly drawn to the area, because it was an area where migrants had always been. It was an area that was again devastated by the loss of heavy industry. It was changing. It was a close-knit community, but it was also an area of social deprivation. And they went there over a period of time, and they worked with the East End sort of pressure group around the development of the docks, which was a very difficult subject. People had varying degrees. It was about property developers, money, the community, all of those pressure points, which all of these issues are current today. Nicholas Battier had been working as a night watchman at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. And it was there he was discovered, and he said, I want to do this project. And so they started putting together what they called the poverty application. What this linked into was Harold Wilson in 1968 had set up the urban programme. There was enormous concern about inner cities, about housing, about inequality, about rising levels of violence, or as different, there were different viewpoints, obviously, different political viewpoints, but there was concern. These cities look, very different now. There were bomb sites in the 1970s. I remember those around London. There were blocks. There were, massive areas of squats and stuff. I lived in a squat in the early 80s, and in Islington of all places. It was all of those things are there. It was very much sort of pockmarked by history and the war. Against that, you had planners. So who was going to be, who were going to be the voices to recreate these communities in the post-war period? The planners were very powerful. The developers were also powerful, but the government wanted to find solutions. They wanted to see if they could, find a way to somehow put these communities together again, to rebuild them. There'd be social cohesion, and it would sort of work well as an urban sort of entity.
Yeah.
So into this come Exit Photography Group. They initially it's set up as a 6-week project. It ran for some 6 years.
Wow.
It was they assembled an extensive document of photographs and interviews.
Yes.
And this was a characteristic of these collectives and these photographers at this time, was to gather information.
Was it an exhibition and a book?
The program was it was expansive and it was an ambitious program. It was to provide a sort of blueprint for education. That's what they were really concerned, to get this work out there. And also to have a book and to have an exhibition. They wanted to have the prints available to people, so they ended up giving a set of the prints to the Gulbenkian at the end of the project.
So you mentioned the Gulbenkian.
Yes.
They were the funders.
The Callas Gulbenkian Foundation, yes, they were the initial funders.
Okay.
So it was because Nicholas Batty had been working there as a night watchman. He had this Peter Brinson who was there, and Richard Mills and Millicent Baumann. They were the 3 sort of figures at the Gulbenkian, as I will refer to it, who were really supportive and helpful, and they gave initial funds.
Okay.
So what they had to do was obviously to make an application for the
Yes.
funds. Anyone who's done sort of Heritage Lottery or Arts Council or will recognise this.
Yeah.
But I love the way it's addressed to whom it may concern.
Yeah.
And all this, when I came to the archive, it's extraordinary because it's all typed. There's pages and pages of it. There's all the correspondence.
Yeah.
You see, now I wonder what would happen with emails and things that, if they're not there in the archive, you can see this trajectory for this work.
Absolutely.
So,
and this isn't the first version of this.
there were sort of
application,
several versions of the application, and they were calling it a photographic study and commentary on the nature of poverty and deprivation in city areas, and the efforts of the residents of such areas to bring about improvements. So there was that idea of self-help and community action. At the time in the 70s, they called it action research. And I always think there was a strong element to these collectives and the photographers I was looking at and the work they did of action research, because the photographs would always be backed up with information and, in some cases solutions, whether it be sort of housing or labour areas. There was a lot of detail that went into it.
Absolutely. Because I was going to ask, how did they go? Did they just get into a car and drive to these places and see what was going on?
Well, they would do, but also they would do research with people who were working there and organisations to try and find a route in, and people find what photographers call access in documentary. They did that, and it was extraordinary. They got into people's houses, workplaces, all sorts of areas, which would now be quite, really much more difficult to negotiate. And they were able to do that. But they did repeated visits to these cities. So that was one of the things they did. And clearly they built some trust. One of the ways they did that was to distribute prints to people.
Okay.
So it was that sort of giving back to the community in that way.
So people who they'd photograph, they'd send them.
Yes.
Right.
Because there was always this idea in documentary of one group looking at another and taking photographs of someone rather than with someone. So they were trying to sort of renegotiate that sort of barrier. And that feeds into the idea of community photography, which again was trying to work in a very different way in a collective and work together in collaboration with other people and the people in the photographs. Mike Cantor, Now, he was with the Community Development Project Information and Intelligence Unit. And there's lots of documents that we have here from the CDP.
Mm-hmm.
So they were very important projects that took place around the country. And there are similarities between these two publications.
Okay. In terms of the relationship with the funders, it was difficult at times, wasn't it?
It would be uneasy because they were given an initial sort of portion of funding, and then they'd use that up, and they had to go back repeatedly to say we need funding, and contingent upon that was this is a difficult, multifaceted project, and various problems have arisen.
Yeah.
And there's an extraordinary letter here to Richard Mills at the Gulbenkian on May 9th, 1976, talking about the problems they came across. The problem of time. How do you schedule all of these shoots, interviews, making the photographs, all of that. Problem of definition. One of the major difficulties, they said, in doing this project was one of definition. So they were always looking, reassessing what the project was. The problem of roles, as they said, they had to do social and community work, housing, immigrant cultures, sociology, history, psychology. The volume of time devoted to these other tasks was not foreseen because they also had to be administrators, researchers, secretaries, photographers. So, and the problem of cooperation, it didn't always, go well to go into a community. Say there was a community organizer there, or there were other people working there. Would they be welcomed? Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes it was a difficult relationship that they had to work around, and sometimes people didn't want to have their photograph taken. So there's obviously throughout the book and the project, people were very happy to be photographed. They were determined to show people not as downtrodden, and there was a great community spirit in many places in the face of adversity.
The group themselves didn't just want to communicate using imagery, did they? They also incorporated a number of interviews on each page, almost, with different people and different organisations. How did these come about?
Well, they did hundreds of hours of interviews. Yeah, so the idea they had of doing these interviews was, there was a lot of research being done around this at the time, and it was about people talking for themselves. And Raphael, Samuel's history workshop was, essential to that movement. So they wanted to get, people talking about their lives, and they did. They got very good, very good testament in that way. Yeah.
So they didn't have any training at all?
They didn't have any training, and you know what you've got to do with interviews, which I do all the time. You've got to do a word-for-word transcript. So that was a very lengthy procedure, and you've got some transcripts here.
Yep.
And they're extraordinary to read. I mean, I was looking at the book earlier today. This one, Born in the Toilet, Linda Parker and her sons.
And this features in the book itself?
It features in the book.
Yeah.
It's very personal. It's funny. And like a lot of the interviews, people didn't hold back. I mean, they really engaged in this conversation.
Yeah.
And they're funny, and they're sometimes profane. There's very strong politics. There's strong commentary about inequality and what people wanted from their lives. So I find the interviews like that extraordinary. And this, you just see the extent of the labour that they had to do, all of these transcripts, pages and pages of them, and then to work out which parts to use. They were edited. They said we had to take out all of the you knows and ahs and ums, and so they did do editing in that way. And then they sort of juxtapose one of these interviews, with a photograph, from another city. So
so they didn't relate in a direct way.
No, then that was a deliberate strategy on their part to stimulate debate, and it referred to this, what was known as the third effect, where you put one item together with another item, it will produce debate and stimulate sort of inquiry in that way and interest.
Creating something new almost.
I mean, Chris Steele Perkins then later told me, he said, I don't know why he bothered to, I don't know why he bothered to do that, but it works very well, and I think it's very clear, and I think the interviews are worth looking at in sort of much more sort of detail, really.
Absolutely.
The photographs are extraordinary, and both Paul, Trevor, he's had an exhibition since then revisiting this work in Liverpool. And Chris Steele Perkins, with his work in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, he's also revisited some of that work. And they've had a very good response from both of those projects. Nicolas Battier died earlier, but there's a lot of interest in this work from curators and academics.
So we've got some of the material here, and particular emphasis on the photographs, and both in the book and the actual proofs that they took. But there's an interesting point in your book, actually, isn't there, in the chapter where you explain about the raw material that went into this?
Well, I started off with this quotation from a document. The raw material of the study consists of 797 rolls of 35mm film, which was approximately 28,000 negatives, and 93 hours of tape recordings. So it was a lot of work, and this raw material, where they wanted a book, and they wanted a resource bank of not less than 250 photographs and a travelling exhibition.
That's incredible.
So they did. This is the book. You've got a copy of this in the library here.
Yeah.
Which has got a very good text as an introduction, and it's got further reading at the back, which shows the breadth of sort of references, economic, social, and political that they were looking at in order to do this work. And I love these pictures. I mean, this is one of Paul Trevor's photographs in Liverpool, and it really does. It shows the strength of the community. It is extraordinary to see photographs of children playing in derelict buildings in the street, because this is what happened at that time. Very few people had televisions. There was no internet. There were no computer games. So there was a lot of playing in the street, and it was just much freer in that way. You see a lot of humour. But you also see, some truly appalling sort of living conditions. At that time.
Because the focus, as we mentioned in the application document, is on poverty. They talk about poverty, deprivation, and those kind of questions and concerns. But it's a really good point that quite a few of the photos do focus on people just having a laugh and really capture that moment where people are completely themselves and very, as I said, evocative of like a moment, a very happy moment in this case.
And some very positive images of people of colour. And at that time, you often didn't even see people in pictures of people of colour in newspapers and magazines. So it was really good to have a positive representation. Yeah. And as they've said since, representation was running throughout this project.
And they photographed, I think, anti-racism demonstrations as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it was people kind of in being political who may not have been protesting,
yes.
who might not have been represented before, or certainly in this way.
Yeah.
There's also some really interesting.
There's some sad pictures. There's just living conditions. I mean, no one should have to live in some of these places. They're quite shocking. And that was, in the public sector as well as the private. That was also another, strong area of work and research for these collectives. Was, obviously housing, and industry. That's a very, bleak photograph in many ways.
Indeed, but they also focus on. I was surprised to see that there's images of. Skyscrapers,
yes,
and kind
the city's being rebuilt,
yeah,
and skyscrapers, yes. I mean, cities in the sky, as they were dubbed. How are they going to work? How are people going to transfer from living side by side to living in these buildings? It worked very well as a model for a planner's model, but in reality, the upkeep wasn't so good. There wasn't landscaping. They weren't always great places to live, as we know. Extraordinary picture of the city here and the bank,
yeah,
with the technology,
all the rotary phones and
yes,
yeah. I guess it would have been cutting edge technology at the time. The technological introduction into the city.
So they looked at different areas of labour in that way, but they were also, it was quite unusual to go in people's homes to do all of these photographs. So that's another feature of this project, was seeing how people lived in that way. But we talk about the materiality of the archive, and you see it here. It is great, and if I had my white gloves, I'd be leafing through these to have a look. But they need to be sort of well preserved in that way. But
so
they're
these were
extraordinary.
Proofs.
Yes, these were proofs. So they would see which proof and see which photograph and which version of it they wanted, what worked best. After they'd been in the darkroom. And it was an expensive and really quite complicated business to take photographs and then print them up. So it's very different now, as it's all done mostly digital through computers and.
Was that why they photographed using black and white film, or was there another reason? I
think that black and white was always allied with some sort of truth and documentation. It was what photojournalists were often using in the 1970s.
So we've taken a look at the final published book, which we've seen here, but in the archive as well, we also took a look at the proofs of the book. So we had the photographs as well, but they actually had a proof of the book itself, didn't you? Which is quite interesting.
This was extraordinary for me to see, and of course it shows the labour that went into these things at the time, all the cut and pasting, the decisions about what went where.
Yeah.
So here you have your printout, and then just putting it all together and deciding. So it's very interesting to see the decisions about how this was going to be put together, and you can hear that's the sound of the pages and the glue and. Just typing everything at that. That's the other thing about this archive. It was all typed. You couldn't edit it. There were no computers. So the amount of sort of labour that they had to put into the project is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons I loved looking at this archive is it's so complete. Because Paul Trevor in particular, he really kept all of the material. So I hope that more research will go ahead from people at the LSE looking into this, certainly from the sociological and political and economic angles, because it's a very good starting point for a project in that way.
I mean, we're lucky to have it in a way. I believe it was offered to the Women's Library, a place I used to work initially. Yeah. But they said that it would be a better fit for LSE, and so they kind of apparently put Paul and the group in touch with the LSE, and that's why it ended up here.
Right.
And it's quite interesting because it's rare that we have a photographic archive or a collection which is so image heavy, which is so kind of dominated by these extraordinary images. But then looking at the materials itself, the aspect of poverty, deprivation, social science and research, it fits like a glove.
It does fit very well, and that's why I'm very pleased that it's here, because I think that any examination of this material should be multidisciplinary, and that's very much my approach in the book, is to reference different areas of theory in that way. The thing about archives is they bring forth funding, and so now what's happening with some of this material from 1970s is, it's being secreted away in various parts, and then, one person gets funding, and then, it becomes not sort of locked away, but it becomes the province of a few researchers. So I hope that lots of different people, will look into this from different institutions, and then you have, a multiplicity of voices looking at this material.
Absolutely. That'd be a wonderful legacy for it as well, I think. Well, I think we've looked at enough material, and hopefully that's given everyone an insight into this archive, this collection, but also, most importantly, Noni's book, which is out and available now. Noni, I want to thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.